I'm Charles Galda, President of Vision New England, and your host for the Church in Action. This week, we're talking with Dr. Terry Dorsett. Terry is the Executive Director of the Baptist Churches of New England. He served in that role since 1994, he didn't serve in that role, but he served in New England since 94. First as a pastor, then as a church planter, a director of missions, church planting catalyst, and then became the Executive Director in 2015. And I'm Charles Galda, your host for the Church in Action. Terry, thanks for being with us.
Well, I'm glad to be with you and appreciate all that you guys do for New England.
Thanks. Now, Terry, you've done a lot of church planting, but I'd like to focus on a topic that may be less familiar to folks, since you do a lot of church revitalization work. And so can you define for folks who that might be a foreign term, what is church revitalization and how is it different from a plant?
Right. Well, I'll tell you, it's actually the church planting that has led us to church revitalization. You know, we have planted so many churches in New England in the last 25 years that now we're realizing that, you know, most communities now have a gospel preaching church. So now we're trying to revitalize churches that already exist and help them become stronger. It doesn't mean there's no need for church planting anymore, but it does seem that that's less of a need. So when I think of revitalization, the key is you're taking an existing church that already has its history, its leadership structure, its sort of, I don't know, whatever it does in the community, its programs and activities, and you're helping them rethink things so they can reach their community with the gospel in a more effective way than what they perhaps have been doing. And you're not trying to create a new church. You're not necessarily changing the name, though sometimes that does happen, but that's not necessarily the goal. The goal is to help that existing church become more effective in giving the gospel to their community. Probably what they were doing 50 years ago that they somehow drifted away from. You're helping them refocus and get back to those things.
And is it they drifted away from it, the common story, or is it that they've stayed with the same methods from 50 years ago and haven't figured out how to adapt, or is it a combination?
I would say it's a combination. Definitely some churches are doing exactly the same thing they've been doing since the 50s, and the culture has changed around us. So that's a piece of it. But sometimes also as a congregation ages, maybe they don't have the energy to do things anymore. And so they once did a big vacation Bible school in the summer, but now they haven't done it in 20 years. And now they're looking around and realizing they don't have any children left. Well, because you haven't done anything to reach children in 20 years. So it's a combination both of not changing methods and of just slowly eliminating events as your congregation ages.
Now, give us some order of magnitude, if you would, because I know you've done tons of church planting. And so in the last, 5 years or whatever, wherever you have the data, how many church plants have you done in 5 years and how many revitalizations would you say you've done?
Well, we've done about 45 church plants in 5 years, and we've done about 30 church revitalizations in 5 years. Now, to put that in perspective, if you took the 5 years before that, we did about 100 church plants and about 3 church revitalizations. So you can see the pretty significant shift that's happened in our ministry.
And what's when you look back in terms of track records, so church still open, still doing well, what's the success ratio for plants versus revitalizations? Is it different or is it pretty similar?
No, it's definitely different. Church planting is much more risky. And we have about 75% success rate with church plants, but of those 75% that remain open 7 years later, maybe a third of them are vibrant and growing, and a third of them have already plateaued at only 7 or 8 years of age, and a third of them are hanging on by a thread and probably won't be there another 5 years. Whereas with church revitalization, at this point, now, Lord, help us to keep this true, at this point, we've yet to have a failure. All of our church revitalizations have become stronger, 100% success rate, so long as you think about success as, what did we say it was, helping a church reach its community more effectively. Doesn't mean that all of them are now tripled in attendance or, have all the bells and whistles, but they are stronger than they were before we started with them. And so far, we haven't had a failure rate. Think about the kind of people who would come and ask us for help. Usually it's the most committed core that's left who are determined that this church won't close on their watch. You give me a group of people like that, and we can do just about anything they want to get done.
Are they normally, I think about just my own church experience, is that at one point the church was just so tired, it seemed they just they just didn't. You kind of float some options, and they really couldn't get their head around it. They were so tired and run down. Is that those folks sound like they're not good candidates? But is that an unusual thing?
So it really depends. When people come to us, there's two kinds of people. There are those who have lost all hope, and basically they're trying to find someone to just give it all to so they don't have to do anything else. Now, we'll take a church like that, but we don't think of that as a church revitalization. That's basically a church plant using an existing building. And so we basically take the building, we send in a new pastor, basically the old church dissolves. So it's not a church revitalization, it's a replant. And in some cases, it's the best thing for that church because they've lost all hope, they've lost all energy, and they're just ready for someone else to do it all. And that's fine. But when someone comes to us and they still have hope, they still got a little fire in their belly, they usually just have a small crowd, an older crowd, and not a whole lot of money. Well, those are some things we can help with. We can find some money, we can find some people, and we can help them reach some younger people because we excel in that. So you give us some people with a little fire in their belly and a building, and we can help those people figure out what to do.
I know in church planting, in most church planting networks or organizations, there's a ton of vetting of both the candidates and the location and all those kinds of things. Is there something similar in church planting, or is it just like, no, if I see energy and I see commitment, that's the filter?
Most of the time we don't do, we do some vetting. We want to make sure this church isn't a church that's got like 4 lawsuits against it or something like that. And basically we end up with all their liabilities. So we do some vetting, but for the most part, the churches that are coming to us oftentimes are in downtown areas, not always a bad area, but usually a downtown area, usually a prominent location. So, I mean, they're the kind of place that we would want to start a church. And again, the people typically are committed, long-term Christians. Well, that's like those are the pieces that you need. They've just lost focus, lost energy, and oftentimes don't have the resources to do something that maybe they've been wanting to do for a decade. They just didn't have the resources.
And I know one of the things when I talk to some other folks who do revitalization in New England, they'll point out that, it's in some ways it's harder for the plant to come in because New Englanders value tradition and being established and being there. So we look at the plant with who are these guys and what are they up to, versus that church that's been struggling on Main Street has been there for 200 years, and we know they're a church and we know they're okay. We don't know, but we've never been in there or anything like that, but we know about them. Right. And so have a trust that a plant doesn't have yet.
That's very true. We're also, now that we've been doing this for a while, we're also noticing that sometimes our church plants, even successful ones, they got 300 people, but you go in there and you don't hear any New England accents. Everybody is from the South or from the Midwest. So basically they have become the colony for all the people from somewhere else to sort of get together and have a worship service like what they had back home. Now, that's not necessarily bad because those people did move to the area. They need to be discipled. They need to be taught. They need to be get on mission. So that's not bad. But if you're trying to reach New England with the gospel, I'm not sure that just reaching transplants from other places accomplishes that. Yeah. Whereas when we look at church revitalization, you go into one of those churches and every accent you hear is either a New England accent or, this is a really cool thing, it's an immigrant accent for someone who's moved to the area and they're not just transient. They're not going to be here for 3 months and move on. They've actually moved to the area. For instance, just as one example, the church that I'm a member of, almost a third of our congregation are Brazilians. Most of them are business people. They moved here from Brazil. They've started a business. They're not going back to Brazil. They're going to be here forever. Well, so now they've become New Englanders, and they were a Baptist. I'm a Baptist. They were a Baptist in Brazil. So they were looking for the Baptist church. And we're actually the only one there are several Baptist churches in our town. We're the only one with the word Baptist still on it. So some people think that's a detriment. We actually find it as a church growth thing because people are looking for a Baptist church. And even though there are at least 4 that I know of in town, we're the only ones with the word Baptist still on the building. So.
Yeah, I've heard that from other people. It's an interesting dynamic because there's a segment of the population, if they see Baptist, and I've got Baptist roots, as you know, they see Baptist and it's like, okay, that's not for me, right? For whatever their perceptions are, right or wrong. But in immigrant communities, I moved in that town. I just went to the Baptist church because where else would you go? And I didn't even know there were different kinds of Baptists. I just went, right? There's only one kind where I came from. And so I assumed this was them too.
That's exactly right. So a third of our congregation is Brazilians, but we have people from 7 countries, in our church, and most of them would be I always hate to stereotype people, put them in a box, but most of them would be, better educated business people who've moved to the area to make a better life for themselves. And now I know other churches sometimes are reaching refugees or reaching other things, and though we've had some of that, that's not been the main influx of our congregation. And so we're Revitalization. We had 12 people 3 years ago. We run about 90 now. We've baptized probably 25 or 30 new believers, but then all the rest of that growth are mostly people who have moved into the area from immigrant countries, or we found a lot of former members who this was their church when they were a teenager. So our church was very, very strong in the 70s, and then, things happen and stuff happens. So now we're finding senior adults who have lived in that town their whole life. That was their church as a teenager, but they haven't been there in 30 years. And now they're hearing about all these exciting things going on, and they're showing back up. So that's been really cool too.
Yeah. And it's worth taking a moment just to dispel a perception, because some people will hear the Baptist Convention New England, and so it's all white folks. You Baptists are all white folks. And I know there's different Baptists, and they would all have a different story. The data doesn't show that. What is it for your strand of Baptist? Because I know it's not all white folks.
Yeah, so I don't know that I can give you numbers nationally because I'm just not familiar with those. I can just give you the New England numbers. Yeah. So 52%, so more than half of our congregations worship. We have 400 churches. More than half of them worship in a language other than English. And another 5% are actually some ethnicity, but they choose to worship in English. For instance, one of our largest churches is Korean, but they choose to worship in English. So it's really 57% of our congregations would be non-Anglo majority. So when people say, oh, you're all white, well, 43% of us are, so a minority are here in New England. Now, that's not true at the national level, but it is true here in New England. The president of our entity is Brazilian. The vice president is Korean. The clerk is Portuguese. So, we have 32 board members, and I don't know, about 35, 40% of them are various ethnicities. We have Bangladesh, Indian, Haitian, pretty much everything, Hispanic from various different countries in South America. So for us, we stopped being a majority white organization, probably 5, 6 years ago.
Yeah, I periodically will see you pop up in my LinkedIn feed, and it's often about where you preached this past Sunday. And I think more often than not, it does not look like a majority white church. It's, like you're saying,
that is very true. So I'm learning how to preach through translators to all these different immigrant groups, and it's been great. It's been a lot of fun, and it's a growing skill for me. To preach through a translator is definitely different. And I chuckle at I was in one church in the Boston area, all highly educated, and they were from a language group. And when I got there, I won't say which language group, but anyway, they did everything, all the worship, the prayers, everything in, their language. And so I got up to preach it. No one got up with me. And so I turned and said, is there someone who can translate? And this older lady in the back speaks in perfect English. She said, we all have degrees from Harvard and MIT. She said, we speak English. We just prefer to worship in our mother language. So I just preached in English. That was wonderful. So you have to respect all that. That's they're trying to keep a piece of their culture, but they're highly educated. They're not, when we watch the news, we hear a stereotype of what an immigrant is. And I think in New England, our immigrants they don't fit that stereotype at all.
Yeah. Yeah. The when you preach to a translator, it takes twice as long, but a lot of immigrant communities are used to longer sermons. So
that is true.
It's out.
Yes, that's true.
And so what are there like three big themes or something like that you say, hey, when I look across revitalization, this is what I see continually. Mm-hmm. And well, let me ask you that first. Are there some common themes there that you haven't already hit on?
Well, if I could, I probably have hit on them, but to reiterate them, almost always they have lost their external focus. They're no longer. It's not that they don't believe the gospel. They believe the gospel. They're just no longer presenting it outside of maybe a few sentences in the sermon, which the only people there are the 10 church members who are already committed to the gospel. So they've lost some kind of interaction with the community. And that's what we have. That's the number one thing we see it over and over and over again. And almost always at one point they had that. It might be 20 years ago. It might be 50 years ago. And there's people left in the room who remember that, just somehow they just got away from that. So that's the number one theme, is they've forgotten to do evangelism. And then maybe a sub theme of that is sometimes they did a lot of good deeds, but forgot to get the gospel in there. So they might have a soup kitchen and they're feeding the hungry, but they're saying, well, we don't want to manipulate them, so we don't give them the gospel. And I'm thinking, if I'm giving you a free meal, I'm also going to give you the gospel in some way. I may not preach a 45-minute sermon, but I'm going to figure out a way to get the gospel, because that's what will change a life. So that's probably the number one sort of theme we see. Probably a secondary theme is usually their building needs a lot of work. We find that most often they've done their very best to keep the front of the building looking decent from the street, and probably the sanctuary looking halfway decent, and the rest of the building is just really bad. I mean, sometimes whole rooms just shut up, filled with trash, just shut, and no one's been in there in 5 years. So a lot of that, just sort of deferred maintenance, there's a lot of it. And then discouragement. They do feel discouraged, but sometimes they're discouraged with hope, and that's different. Discouraged with no hope is hard to resurrect. Discouraged with hope is that you can do something with that.
Now, I would presume your biggest challenge in it is that what you're really talking about is change, and people don't like change. New England people don't like change. New England church people don't like change. And so how do you deal with what you're basically going to tell people is they're going to have to change things, and sometimes in significant ways, I assume.
Oh, yeah. It almost always requires change, because if whatever they're doing was working, they wouldn't be calling us to get revitalization. But what we've learned is oftentimes they have in their history the patterns they needed to be revitalized. They've just forgotten their history. So we always tell a pastor, a church planter, or our consultants that work with it is, let's learn the church history, and let's use that to our advantage. So, for instance, we revitalized a church in Vermont, and I read the entire 150 years worth of minutes one winter. Read them all handwritten, and it was something. Yes. And I made a list of about 20 really cool things they had done in their history, and we started using those things as sermon illustrations. For example, one of their struggles at that particular church was they just had high expectations of the children who came to Sunday school. Basically, they were looking for perfectly well-behaved Sunday school children in a community in which none of those existed anymore. Yeah. Instead, they had a bunch of ADHD people, So anyway, we found in the history when they started their Sunday school in the 1800s, a guy named H. Collier. We never could figure out what the H stood for, but H. Collier, a man, his passion was that every child in the community would have a chance to hear the gospel. And so we talked about that. We said, your church's heritage is that every child in this community should be able to hear the gospel, not just the ones that are really well behaved from a 2-income family that has tutors and all that kind of stuff, And that it took a while, but we just kept talking about that. Now, admittedly, the current Sunday school director eventually had to resign because she didn't want to deal with troubled children, and we had to redo, the way we did Sunday school in order to accommodate the situation. But 2 years later, they had 40 children in their Sunday school, and that church has never gone back. And all we had to do was remind them of their own commitment to reaching all the children of the community. So while yes, it's change that's based on a really healthy past. Most churches in New England have a period in their past in which they were very healthy and strong. And so sometimes simply reminding them of that and helping them think through that is what needs to help them. So it's change, but it's change in a historically acceptable way.
That's a fascinating change management strategy, because normally it's just, we're going to plot a new thing and we're going to get stakeholders and try and address objections, but actually changing us back to who we were, in a sense. Right. That's a fascinating approach.
And we always try very hard not to change the name of the church. And that is oftentimes exactly what some organizations want to do. And there may be a moment when that does need to happen, but I just rarely think that that's the first thing. I doubt that anyone driving by is thinking, well, I'm not going to that church because it's called Agape Christian Fellowship, or it's called First Baptist Church, or it's called Christian Assembly of United Christian Assembly, or whatever the name is. No one's thinking that as they drive by. No one. They're thinking, I don't go to that church because I don't know anybody there. I don't know what that church does. I have no connection to that church. It has no meaning in my life. So let's solve those things. And if 5 years down the road, you need to change the name, 10 years down the road, you can. But what we're finding that the name really just doesn't, it's a lot less important than what people think it is. Yeah. It's the people that are important.
Is there a typical kind of, as you're changing things, we drop off because we lose some folks, but then we build up? Or is it just, no, we just start, everybody's bought in, so we're just building up from there?
Yeah, that really does depend on the church. the church that I'm currently in, that's in Marlborough, Massachusetts, without question, our growth has been so rapid because they all did buy in. They had 12 members and none of them left, even though some of the changes were significant and big. They've just stuck with it. They just have believed in this, and so that's been great. We have other churches where within just a matter of 2 or 3 months, a key leader or two, often the person who invited you to come help them create the change, then realizes, oh, wait a minute, I'm not in charge anymore, and then they leave. So what we say is you should be prepared to lose about 20% of your current people. But if you have 15, that means you're going to lose 2 or 3, which is always sad. Yeah. But you're going to gain 50. So, it's you hate to say who's worth more, but it's just the reality. So about 20% is what we anticipate, but sometimes you don't lose any. It really just depends on what was the final impetus that forced them to call us. If it was that the furnace went out and we can't afford to pay the furnace, so we'll sign up for this program so we can get someone to help us fix the building, they're more resistant to change. If it's that someone said, looking around going, boy, there's just nobody here anymore. We want the gospel to go to our community. How can we fix that? Hey, here's this group that helps us do that. Those people are going to move faster and be more open, even if they're, some things make them uncomfortable.
And I'm guessing as you're helping them re-engage their community is what I hear a key piece of this is. As you're helping do that, there's going to be some stuff they're going to have to stop doing to make space for that. And that will hurt someone's feelings, and I'm going to leave over that sometimes, right?
Absolutely. Sometimes we've had to make it's not that they're bad decisions. It's just oftentimes churches, they shrunk down to what was comfortable for the people that were left. Mm-hmm. And it just doesn't work for everyone else, and I've gone into, not that bathrooms are the key to church growth, but I've seen some bathrooms there definitely were detriments to church growth. Okay. Especially if you're trying to reach a young family and, the urinal is taped up with, the trash bag clearly hasn't worked in years and the door doesn't shut. And so there's a gap and everyone can wave at you as they walk by. I mean, these kind of things are maybe in the 1950s, people accepted that. Maybe, I don't really know, but they're not going to do that today. So, you start changing some things and people are like, oh yeah, we've needed to fix that. So they're okay with that. But then when you get into the Sunday morning worship hour and you say, hey, we're going to actually do this and this and this different, that's when people get a little bent out of shape. And then when you decide, whatever, the Tuesday morning prayer meeting at 10 a.m., which does appeal to the 10 senior adults that you have left, doesn't work for anybody who's still working. When you say, I think we're going to either cancel that or we're going to, find a different way to do prayer. We're going to go to a Zoom prayer meeting or something. I don't know, whatever it is you decide to do. That's where it starts getting a little more tough. But, that's where they have to decide, do we really want to reach people or do we just want to be comfortable with ourselves until there's none of us left? So
now Terry, if I'm not part of the Baptist churches of New England, is this something I could talk to you about?
So yes, that's the short answer is yes. The long answer is much longer, So we have a church revitalization director, and because we care about kingdom, he'll have an initial conversation with anyone that's, so long as you're evangelical and have a generally close to our theology, thing, he'll talk with anyone, and he'll even have, one good consultation with some people. If you're not part of the Baptist churches of New England and you say, boy, I like what you're saying, we would like you to help us with this, then there's a fee involved. And if your church is willing to pay it, he's willing to do it. But because you're not part of the organization, you can't expect consultation for free, then, we also, and this happens a lot. We have a lot of churches that reach out to us from other denominations, and they love their denomination and they love the people in their denomination, but their denomination, for whatever reason, is just not able to help them. And that's not a judgment. All right. All denominations are struggling right now. Every denomination is struggling. And, so you can't judge them for that, but they just don't have anything to offer at that moment. It doesn't mean they don't have anything to offer ever, but at that moment, what that church needs, it's just they don't have something. So we have encouraged churches to not leave their denomination because we don't want to be the sheep stealer, but we do allow dual affiliation where we say, hey, okay, you can remain part of your group, which is your historic connection and the things that they do offer that are helpful. You can keep using them, and then you can also join our group. And so I would say the majority of churches we work with, that's the route they take, because they enter into just a whole new level of resourcing that they can get by being part of us. And that's a big blessing to them.
What I always love about when I deal with you denomination leaders in New England is the relationships you have with each other, and exactly that point about we're here for the kingdom, and we're not trying to be parochial. And I remember you telling stories about, well, there have been people who come to me and said, hey, we want to be part of the BCNE, and you've said, well, I think you're going to fit better over here based on where you are. And
Yes.
there's a beauty to that, to the unity you guys have. We can't all know each other and be friends with each other and all, but and we're never going to do away with denominations. I know sometimes people think of unity that way. I don't. It's when the denomination leaders are friends with each other, care about each other. I think there's a beauty in that. And the first time I met with you, that was one of the things I learned. And I think it's so beautiful, and I'm grateful to you for it. If somebody wants to, go ahead.
I was going to say that's really important to us, because obviously I'm a Baptist, and I'm a particular strain of Baptist. So I have certain, whatever theological beliefs and practices and things like that. But the gospel is bigger than just my group. And so when churches come to us, for instance, just to give you a very common example, we often have churches that maybe come from a congregational background that will come to ask us for help. And they have a very different belief on baptism than we do. Sometimes we can talk it through and maybe they can come to our belief, but most of the time that's not going to happen. But thankfully, there's a really, the 4 C's are an excellent group. And we can say, well, here's a group that fits. It's the same theology as us, but they just have the same view on baptism as your church, and they can help you. And so that's like a really good, same thing with some of our more Pentecostal brothers. I mean, the 4C, AG, thank you. I'll get it right. And also the Foursquare Gospel, though the AG's is stronger, but the Foursquare Gospel is also here. And so depending on where they're at in New England, we say, hey, you should call this guy because he can help you. Same thing as us. They just believe in some of the sign gifts. So why would your church want to be feel restricted by some of our Baptist things if you can do it, in a way that fits your church? So it's, I don't know. I just think it is a beautiful thing here in New England.
I completely agree. If Terry, folks are listening to this and saying, hey, I'd like to get more information on this, where can they go? Who can they talk to?
All right, well, they can go to our website, which is BCNE, Baptist Churches New England, bcne.net. And across the top, there's various boxes. They can just look for kind of scroll through them till they get to the church revitalization thing. And there's a place they can email Gary Moritz, who's our church revitalization director.
Terry, thanks so much, not just for doing this, but thank you for your ministry and all the support you provide to not just Baptist churches, but the church in New England. I'm really grateful to you.
Well, we're happy to do it, and we're happy to take our place in the sort of what God is doing in New England for many, many years. Our particular entity, because we were connected to a national denomination that was so big, honestly, for years, we just kind of ignored other evangelicals in New England. And part of my coming 10 years ago to the office here was to say, no, let's not ignore them. Let's actually link arms with them. Let's be with them because we're in this together. And so that's been really good for us. It's made us healthier. I like to think it's made the whole kingdom in New England healthier.
Absolutely. As you know, and Jesus prays in John 17, when we manifest that unity, then people will know God sent his son. So it's evangelism. So I'm grateful to you, brother.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much.
To support this program and accelerate evangelism, go to visionnewengland.org and click on donate, or click member to become a partner with us. This program is supported by the Palau Association, who are dedicated to proclaiming the good news, uniting the church, and impacting cities worldwide.
At Leadership Transformations, we believe that when you have the right resources to help you slow down and experience a deep and refreshing connection to God, you can become the discerning leader you know you are created to be. Friends, Steve Macchia here, and I have a free gift for your soul. It's called Pathways. Pathways is our weekly email aimed at offering you soul-nourishing content for the journey. It contains readings, prayers, spiritual practices, a link to the Discerning Leader podcast, as well as information about all of our upcoming soul care retreats, workshops, and online offerings. So head on over to leadershiptransformations.org today and sign up for this free resource. It will help you slow down and be more. God bless you, friends.